Okay, I'm sending you the link so that you can share with your um,
That's a YouTube link.
yes,
And please start recording.
correct. Yeah. Recording has been started.
Good morning, our viewers in United States, and good afternoon to our distinguished guest today, who is based in New Delhi, India. On behalf of the Council for Strategic Affairs, we are having yet another session or another episode of Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee. And our distinguished guest, with whom I'll be carrying a conversation today, is Ambassador Gurjit Singh, and we shall be talking about NATO and the Indo-Pacific. Today is Saturday, July 29, 2023. It is 7:30 a.m. Eastern Daytime, and actually it is 5 p.m. in New Delhi, India. And this is our distinguished guest, Ambassador Gurjit Singh. A little bit about Ambassador Gurjit Singh. He went to school at the prestigious Mayo College in Ajmer and obtained his bachelor's degree with honors in politics, and then at St. Xavier's College in Kolkata. He is a postgraduate in international studies from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He has attended programs at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, Indian Institute of Mass Communications, and Indian School of Business. Besides the Indian languages and English, he has acquired proficiency in Japanese at the Naganuma School in Tokyo. Post-retirement, he has been appointed as honorary professor. He was professor of international relations at IIT Indore. He has lectured as part of Shaping Young Minds program of the AIMA, besides experience sharing at defense, educational establishments, and universities. As far as his diplomatic career is concerned, he is a former ambassador of India to Germany, Indonesia, Ethiopia, ASEAN, and the African Union. He has chaired CII Business Task Force on Trilateral Cooperation in Africa, including Asia-Africa Growth Corridor with Japan. He comments on current events on TV and in journals. He reports on such cooperation focused on private sector engagement to make trilateral successful. He is very active in the social sphere also. I'm not going to read everything. A very detailed introduction can be found from his website www.gurjitsingh.com. He is also interested in Indian cinema. So here is the proof of pudding. We are going to start our interview with Ambassador Gurjit Singh. And the topic, as I said earlier, is NATO and the Indo-Pacific. So our viewers, this is the logo of the NATO. NATO was actually started with 10 European countries and 2 North American countries in 1949 in the aftermath of Second World War and with the emergence of Soviet Union as the second superpower. At this time, NATO has 31 countries as its members, Finland being the latest member. Sweden is approved to be admitted despite some glitches. And of course, Ukraine's Zelensky has claimed that his country is almost a member of NATO, if not a de jure or de facto member of NATO. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia are also in line, And Article 5 of NATO Charter confers protection to NATO members so that all are obligated to come to the defense if one member is attacked. So we are going to have a conversation with our distinguished guest, Ambassador Gurjit Singh. Welcome, Ambassador. Namaskar. Uh, you have been a distinguished practitioner of diplomacy for more than 3 decades. And as I said in my introduction, NATO was started in 1949 in the aftermath of Second World War and emergence of Soviet Union. In today's context, what is the relevance, what is the raison d'etre of NATO as a military alliance? Ambassador Gurjit Singh? Did we lose him? Ambassador Gurjit Singh?
He's connected, but I don't know.
We're not getting any picture or even sound.
He's not on mute either. Sir, are you able to hear us?
Now I am able to hear you. Earlier it had frozen.
Okay. So the question was, as a practitioner of diplomacy for more than 3 decades, what is the context now? Or what is the reason or rationale for NATO as a military alliance in today's context, although it was started in post-World War II era?
Thank you for having me on the show, Dr. Adityanjee, and my compliments for starting this discussion forum as part of your initiatives to bring an understanding of international relations to the wider public. I've had the occasion to being posted in 2 NATO countries, Germany and Italy, and in 2 Indo-Pacific countries, Japan twice and Indonesia, where I was also ambassador to ASEAN. So I have some understanding of both. During my university days, I actually studied for an MPhil in American studies. So I can also confess that I have some understanding of US foreign policy. So, for all purposes, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union broke up, the Warsaw Pact diminished. There was actually no further requirement of NATO because there was no military challenge to Europe. And after 1989, all the battles were being fought in Asia or in Africa. So you may recall that there are 3 major, battles. One is in Yugoslavia. As Yugoslavia was disintegrating, there were battles there. There was Iraq, and before that, and after that, Afghanistan. So this is where NATO started to play a role, which was perhaps outside its original remit, because there was not a challenge from the Soviet Union anymore. I mean, in Afghanistan, the challenge was from terrorism. In the case of Iraq, it was for the so-called weapons of mass destruction. And in Serbia, you were basically, in former Yugoslavia, you were fighting local people. So NATO started being used like a cat's paw in whatever came your way. And basically, American policy dictated where those countries would need to contribute. Now, the interesting part of this is that whenever the Americans went anywhere, whether it is Iraq or Afghanistan, a large number of countries would join them. NATO partners, would be NATO partners, would be NATO members, everybody joined them. So there was a kind of preponderance of American power, which was being channeled through NATO. Now, this NATO, as I explained, was not an anti-Russian configuration, but a exercise of American power. And one thing you must remember, that in none of these three examples that I mentioned, India was not a part of these operations, ever. So there was no link between India and NATO as such. But when you come into the current period, more recent period, you find that years of peace and Europe building up a trade for security relationship with Russia means that Europe is now seeking an autonomy from US policy vis-a-vis Russia and in Europe. So we all know that the Ukraine crisis became a war in February 2022. But even a month before that, the German Chancellor and the German Foreign Minister were in Washington, and they were telling Americans that leave this to us, we will handle it. So, if you ask me, in the current scenario, what are the three main things which emerge? The first is a rejuvenation of American power in Europe. Second, the diminishing of European autonomy. They have all come behind NATO now. They don't talk less about the European Union, more about NATO. And the third is treating Russia as enemy number one. And this has polarized the world, brought a new disorder in international politics, from whom presumably American policy based on NATO hopes to ride into a new sunrise. So
I think you
that is
have
how
very
I
well,
would like to explain this.
you very well answered this question. And for our viewers, I put this visual. It actually shows NATO missions not only in Europe but in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Turkey, in Somalia, in Gulf of Aden. So I think this visual is very beautifully depicting NATO's, creeping enlargement of the territory which it brings under its own purview. If one may recall, the first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, had very famously said, the purpose of NATO is to keep Americans in, Soviets out, and Germany down in the Europe. That was the raison d'etre of NATO. And in today's context, there's no Soviet Union. Germany is not down. In fact, Germany is the most vibrant economic power in Europe, and America economically is declining. So that is the reality we are facing in today's world. And Ambassador Gurjit Singh, you have explained it very beautifully that NATO, in a sense, is trying to replace United Nations. Any comments on that?
You know, this is one of the problems of the new international order. I think the United Nations is not able to function. The Security Council is paralyzed. They could not deal with the Ethiopian civil war. They could not deal with the situation in Myanmar. And they can't deal with Ukraine. You see WTO, which is one of the most important things, that is dysfunctional because of American desire not to have the dispute settlement mechanism. You look at the WHO, that became a problem because the Chinese will not cooperate with it. So the big powers who were supposed to hold the international order and the UN together are today not even talking to each other, leading to this disruptive influence and the rise of plurilateral, let's say, plurilaterals and minilaterals. But the problem with these plurilaterals is that they act unilaterally. For instance, sanctions against Iran in the past, China, now Russia, they deeply trouble the global south. And they are not UN-backed sanctions. They are essentially NATO sanctions. So suddenly people feel this is not my war, I have no interest in it, and yet I am being asked to choose sides and I am being asked to not deal with people who globalization promised me I will be able to deal with everybody. So the promise of globalization is being throttled by unilateral sanctions.
So coming to the concept of Indo-Pacific, I am putting this visual to show our viewers what is the Indo-Pacific region. In your opinion, in today's geopolitical context, what is the significance of Indo-Pacific region and its economic relevance?
So, before the Indo-Pacific, the concept was the Asia-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific was an economic functional concept, largely working under a US security umbrella in the region. But as the US pulled out, they opened space for China to move quickly and occupy much of the vacuum left by the United States before too many people even realized that the Chinese were all over the place. Around this time, the Indo-Pacific concept comes up. Now, the Indo-Pacific concept compared to Asia-Pacific is a much larger concept in the sense that Asia-Pacific probably stopped with ASEAN, that is up to Myanmar. But Indo-Pacific includes India. Now, India likes to take it beyond to the Indian Ocean, which some other countries do, not all. Second, while Asia-Pacific was a functional concept, Indo-Pacific is a strategic concept. It is not necessarily an economic concept, though there is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, but that does not have all the countries of the Indo-Pacific in it. It only has 13, 14 countries. So this is the difference, that Indo-Pacific is a strategic concept, and this shows that American power alone was inadequate to deal with China. Therefore, on one hand, there was an assertiveness of China. There was an inability of ASEAN to cope with that assertiveness. Therefore, ASEAN partners like the US, India, Japan, Australia came together into the Quad to make sure that whatever China had gained was a problem for ASEAN, but China should not be allowed to make the South China Sea into a Chinese territorial water. And therefore, they must be resisted. And that is where this battle has been joined. And that is where the importance of the Indo-Pacific. So while NATO was looking at Russia and reviving because of Russia, the Indo-Pacific is essentially a reaction to China. But while NATO excludes Russia, many of our concepts of the Indo-Pacific are actually inclusive. Even the Indian concept is inclusive, as announced by Prime Minister Modi at the Shangri-La dialogue in 2018. We are not ready, so long as everybody abides by a rules-based order, we are there. But we don't want to follow other people's rules. So just as we don't want to follow Chinese rules in the Indo-Pacific, we don't want to follow American sanctions blindly everywhere. I mean, this needs to be understood.
I think you have very beautifully explained the concept of Indo-Pacific And ASEAN, you've been ambassador to ASEAN, and I put it this visual about ASEAN. One of the issues about ASEAN is that ASEAN has always been uncomfortable about big power rivalry in their region. ASEAN doesn't want to side either with China or with US. Would NATO's push for a security structure in the Indo-Pacific not go against ASEAN's stated stance of centrality of ASEAN in any decision-making forum? And if such a push were to be made, would it not cause tensions with the ASEAN countries for NATO?
Thank you. So I would describe ASEAN policy as leaning to the powerful side. So long as the American security umbrella was there, they were leaning to the Americans. When the Chinese started taking over whatever they wanted under the 9-line, ASEAN countries were quite willing to engage with China through the BRI and trade and investment and loans. So it is leaning to he who is powerful. I think when you ask me about NATO in the Indo-Pacific and the discomfort that ASEAN would have with it, I think there are steps in between which we must look at. First, ASEAN was uncomfortable with the modern concept of Indo-Pacific. There was an Indo-Pacific which Indonesia started talking about in 2012, but the Indo there was Indonesia, not India. So when the Indo-Pacific, which India, Japan, Australia, and the US talk about, there was concern in ASEAN. Why? Because evidently the free and open Indo-Pacific concept is basically saying freedom from whom? The challenge of China, unstated. And the Chinese and the Russians consistently opposed the use of the term Indo-Pacific. They said this is a challenge to China, and the preferred term is Asia-Pacific. So, if you see ASEAN in 2019, they adopted the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific after explaining to China that this is what they meant and it was not anti-China. But if you see ASEAN documents even till 2023, when they talk of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, inside they write the Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So they try and create a separation in the text. So slowly there is a reconciling of ASEAN with the Indo-Pacific. Why? Because they were discomforted by Quad and subsequently by AUKUS. Now, AUKUS is a military strategic alliance. Quad was originally a quadrilateral security dialogue, but I think in Quad 2.0, the Indian role has been to persuade its partners to talk more about engaging ASEAN and the Pacific Islands, talk more of functional collaboration and less about the military dimension. So this means that a comfort with Quad is slowly emerging, but there is still no Quad ASEAN dialogue. I'm hoping it will come, but it's not there yet.
So, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, most of the Chinese analysts have characterized the Quad as quote unquote, deliberately actually, as quote unquote Asian NATO and opposed it ideologically. Speaking for India, India has been lukewarm about converting the Quad into a military alliance. However, the US intention is to try to convert Quad into some sort of military dimension. There are talks about, having a permanent headquarter of Quad, etc. So what is your opinion about expectations of Quad to take more military role in the Indo-Pacific region?
So if you come and see the challenge of China, there is no doubt that it requires a coordinated military response, because none of the Quad partners can independently take on the rising Chinese military might. That is why the original Quad is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. But we don't call it that today because we have moved beyond the military. So there is military coordination, there is joint exercises, quadrilateral, trilateral, many. But we have successfully moved the Quad into functional areas. And if you read the communique of the last 3 Quad summits, you will see basically it is wooing ASEAN. So ASEAN wants reassurance that Quad will not draw them into a rivalry with China. Now, about 2 months ago, when the Indonesian President Jokowi, who is the current chair of ASEAN, was going to Australia, he said that the Quad and AUKUS are not competitors to ASEAN, and we can always find some way of cooperating with them. Now, saying that about Quad made sense. How you can coordinate with a military alliance like AUKUS, but this is typical ASEAN. So what you have now is an American desire to militarize the Indo-Pacific, an Indian desire not to provoke China and keep more engagement with ASEAN and the Pacific Islands, but hold China in check for further gains in the Indo-Pacific. So therefore, the 4 Quad partners all have difference in nuance. The Japanese are US treaty allies, defense treaty. Australians are ANZUS and AUKUS. India is the only one which is a non-NATO ally, basically getting bilateral defense assistance. So I would like to say that India understood when America withdrew unilaterally from Afghanistan that the Quad did not have a global outlook, which was commonly shared among all 4 partners. It was essentially confined to the Indo-Pacific. So India has focused more on that area. And therefore, when you talk about NATO or Africa or anywhere else, the congruence has to be case by case. And it is not going to be instituted where India is concerned.
So coming to the Quad, there is some, talk about converting Malabar exercises into essentially Quad's naval exercises. Similarly, although China is deliberately using the concept of Asian NATO to scare ASEAN countries, I think implicitly United States approves that because of the presumed military dimension. If you go to history, there was a military alliance called SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or so-called Manila Pact. And all of us know what happened to the fate of that particular treaty, military alliance. This concept of Asian NATO, which is basically an oxymoron, if pursued zealously, what would be the outcome? Would it be the same outcome as SEATO? Are we dealing with a region which is too fractured, too heterogeneous to have a military alliance like NATO-like alliance in Indo-Pacific?
The Indo-Pacific's main challenge is China. 2 years ago, who would have imagined that the Ukraine crisis would have happened and NATO's intentions would start going towards Russia and they would try to drag their friends in the Indo-Pacific into that. So international relations has become so dynamic that you cannot predict a year ahead. But coming back to your question, Philippines and Thailand were the 2 Southeast Asian countries who were with SEATO. Now you see, Philippines has revived its military engagement with the US and trilaterally with Japan. And I think they are ready to allow use of their northern bases in Philippines in case of a Taiwan crisis. Now, this is because the current presidency of Philippines is adopting a different approach to China than the last presidency. Thailand, the military regime in Thailand is still pro-China. Now, there has been an election and a new government is expected. Whenever the new government comes, will they adopt a different approach? I can't say. But what you asked me, I think the essence of that is this. ASEAN countries are ambivalent as to how long US commitment to them will remain. You know, when President Obama was there, they kept speaking about a pivot to Asia, which never happened. Trump was not interested in ASEAN. Biden and his team are deeply interested in the Indo-Pacific. But what happens in the next US election? So India, Japan, ASEAN countries, Australia, we are all committed to keep a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure Americans will be committed, but intensity of their commitment, that will determine in the next presidential election. So this often leads to uncertainties in reckoning. So ASEAN countries are more worried about. I think India takes it in its stride because India has to deal with the US bilaterally also. So for us, managing relations with the US, developing them with whoever is in power in Washington is a basic tenet of Indian policy. And we hope to leverage that in the Indo-Pacific.
So you did mention about the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. Then the question comes, by whose perspective? By US perspective or Indian perspective? Now, as part of their jargon about free and open Indo-Pacific, United States has been conducting freedom of naval operations FONOP. And I think in January of 2022, they had conducted on India's, in Indian Ocean, in India's exclusive economic zone. You can't have free and open Indo-Pacific without any rules, especially since United States is not a member of UNCLOS. So I see a lot of difficulty there. How you would invoke free and fair, open Indo-Pacific and keep on getting into conflict with your allies because you yourself don't follow the international rules about the UNCLOS. You are not a signatory to UNCLOS. Any comments on that?
It's an interesting viewpoint. So first, unlike say Japan or Australia, the Indian concept of the Indo-Pacific is free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. We use the word inclusive, which the Japanese and the Australians don't use. So that is one difference. The second part is when we talk of a rules-based international order, the rules come from the UN and its system. Now, you pointed out that we expect the Chinese to abide by UNCLOS, which they have signed. But who's asking them the loudest? Americans who have never ratified. Same goes to climate change. We want the Chinese and partners in climate change. Who are the one who did not ratify Kyoto Protocol? Americans. So the Americans tell everybody to abide by international rules, but often don't follow them themselves. So I don't think India today is trying to lecture the Americans on how to run their policy or what to do. We are trying to find areas of congruence with them, bilaterally, regionally, globally. And where it suits us and them mutually, we will work with them. Same with Japan, same with Australia. Now, Australia is a prime example. You know, when the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations were on, it was not only China which was difficult for India, it was Australia which was very difficult. But once the Quad came back, the Australians came to India for a strategically determined comprehensive economic partnership. So for them, strategy is now in control rather than economics. So with each country, it is a different priority which is running. And India has to juggle those.
Okay. Recently, a United States Congressional Committee on China made a recommendation that the NATO plus 5 mechanism should be enlarged to make NATO plus 6 mechanism to include India. No formal decision was made by the United States government. It was just a recommendation of, congressional committee. In response to that, the MEA, Dr. S. Jaishankar, rejected the idea that, India's priorities do not align with NATO's priorities. Some Indian American activists and lobbyists have become hyper vocal in this regard. What are your personal views based on your diplomatic experience about India being party to any NATO mechanism whatsoever, NATO plus 5 or NATO plus 6? Is that in long-term interest of India?
No, not at all. NATO's primary aim is to confront Russia. Russia has been one of the steadfast friends of India. So this is a basic contradiction between NATO aims and Indian aims. All these years when the Americans tried to pillory us in the UN Security Council and side with Pakistan, the Russians came to our aid. But that Russia is not the same Russia today. We also know that. And we have also been trying to find alternatives to Russia. But to be honest, everybody in the West who wants to woo India has still not been able to do for us what Russia did. But we have to be clear about it. Second, we want to be designated by the US in a category which allows transfer of defense technology to India. Now, if under that you need to classify us as some kind of NATO associate without us having to formally join NATO, I think that is fine because there is benefit to us. I mean, you will say, I cannot transfer technology to somebody who is not part of a system. So that part is okay. So that is where I differentiate between bilateral, regional, and global. So globally, there is no congruence between India and NATO. Regionally, we prefer not having them in the Indo-Pacific. Bilaterally, I think we have been classified as a non-NATO ally, which allows us to buy weaponry and aircraft. But now the time has come for transfers of technology. Now let us see where we go and what classification is required. So I think that part is what we need to do. So Dr. Jaishankar, besides saying what you quoted, sometime back in Europe, he said that Europe believes that their problems should be our problems, but does not want our problems to be there. But I think now NATO is carrying this too far, but trying to come into Indo-Pacific and say, okay, we share your problem. I mean, we want them to share our concerns with China, not bring their problem with Russia to us.
So one of the problems of any NATO-related mechanism is that even if you become a limited party, there is no free lunch. Yes, there may be some technology transfer, but like any NATO activity, there will be a pressure on India to grant some naval bases. What are your thoughts on that? If India were to, in a limited way, cooperate with NATO?
Between a base and facility, I think we have got several agreements with the US and many Western countries which provide access in a safe way for their ships and aircraft to come to India, whether it is for repair, rest, or whatever is required. And please look back in 1991 during the Gulf War, India did not have these arrangements. Yet the Chandrasekhar government permitted American planes to land in India for refueling and going off to the Gulf. So when your mutuality is established, there is no problem. But as you in your earlier question asked, where was the need for the Americans to sail through the Lakshadweep EEZ without informing India in advance? Would India have said no? This was just thumbing your nose at a friend for no particular reason.
I think you are right, and one has to be a little wary about, NATO expansion in Indo-Pacific region because it may not align with each country's, each individual country's national interests. Now, in case of a future geopolitical crisis in Indo-Pacific, like you said, that nobody contemplated the Ukraine crisis, and Ukraine crisis gave NATO again a rationale to enlarge itself, give membership to Finland, and of course Sweden is on board. Similarly, if a crisis is created or precipitated by Xi Jinping's adventuristic military policies in various scenarios, let's say in terms of possible invasion of Taiwan, a possible conflict with Japan about the Senkaku Islands, or with Philippines for that matter on Scarborough Shoals, uh, would NATO come gung-ho in full form with all the 31 countries or 32 countries in the Indo-Pacific region in a future conflict that may be precipitated by China?
Simple thing like opening a NATO office in Tokyo did not meet a consensus at the NATO summit in Vilnius recently. So if you can't even agree that we can open an office in Japan, to go to where you are saying about action against China, I think that's a far cry and unlikely to happen. But that is not to say nothing will happen. So I would say there are four major flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific which could blow up. One is Chinese interdict shipping in the South China Sea, using their acquired shoals and islands. That may lead to a issue. Second, a larger problem in the Senkakus with Japan. Japan has been very patient, but now you see that the Russians and the Chinese are repeatedly exercising and going through Japanese water through Honshu and Hokkaido. Last week, for the first time, Chinese bombers took off from Russian bases to go up to Japan. And then there is Taiwan, which is a very live conflict. But don't forget, there is also Myanmar, which is an internal conflict with nothing to do with Russia. But if Myanmar continues to implode, it can have reverberations in the region where India, Bangladesh, China, Thailand are concerned. So every conflict is not NATO linked. Now you have Japan, which is a NATO partner, as is Australia. They are also treaty allies with the US, like Korea is. So will the Americans drag them into a Taiwan crisis? In the case of the Senkakus, the Japanese kept asking that does the US-Japan treaty cover the Senkaku? And when the Americans finally clarified that it did, they also obtained the clarification that the treaty also covers Taiwan. In case of a crisis, Japan is expected to help. The Philippines, I think, knows that if required, their bases will be used. The expansion of American presence in Australia is going to be a staging post if China is to be countered in the South Pacific or in Taiwan. Now, Korea is and New Zealand are two bits out of the way. Korea is having its own policy. New Zealand is trying to keep out of a firefight. But these are all issues where each country has a different engagement with the US. With that, India has no problem because our three Quad partners are far more linked to each other than we are to any of them in defense matters. But we have the enabling agreements to allow logistics, shipping with the Japanese. We can use their base in Djibouti, the French we have, the Germans we have. So I think we welcome countries with an Indo-Pacific outlook to come to our region to basically keep China under control. But that objective is not met by NATO, and hence our reservation on it.
I think anything to do with NATO in Indo-Pacific and creating new military alliances on top of the existing alliances, the new alliance being AUKUS. There are already other intelligence sharing mechanisms like Five Eye, ANZUS. So you are creating layers and layers of security structures in the Indo-Pacific. Would it not be more prudent to just focus on the economic issues? Why China is dominant now is because of the economic dominance. Unfortunately, both China and United States tooth and nail opposed India's entry into APEC, India as a participating economy. And that did create some, setbacks economically for India to expand its trade and other things. Would it not be wiser for United States at this point in time to push NATO onto India is to work for India's entry into APEC in November of 2023 when APEC is hosted by United States in San Francisco?
So APEC, in 1989 when it was formed, some of the ASEAN countries did not feel India met their expectations. It's only after 1991 and the Look East policy that they started looking. And in 2013, when Indonesia was the chair of APEC, there was a real effort to bring India in, but the Chinese vetoed. So I don't think the Americans will try it because the Chinese veto will still prevail. The Chinese are clear that the rise of India must be curtailed. So they will not let you come anywhere. In RCEP also, they made it so difficult that ultimately we had to leave. But on the other side, the Chinese have integrated ASEAN through supply chains into their economy. So for ASEAN, China is a major export destination. But neither Japan nor Australia nor the US offer the same kind of trade access to either India or ASEAN. That is a weak link. So what are you going to do? So even when you look at association through IPEF, the Americans are more keen on having a common technology on 5G, on cybercrime, maritime security technology, AI, basically to ensure that China does not enter these markets. So that battle is the larger one. But are they helping us to gain access to their markets? No. They are among the most protectionist, and so are the Japanese. So where Australia has woken up a bit and trying to economically engage India, India is complaining that our exports to US and Japan do not rise commensurate with the partnership that we talk of. Whereas frankly to China, the trade is booming mainly because of their exports to us, not our exports.
I think one of the problems with RCEP or RCEP was not accepting services as a component. And that has been always an issue, whether it is APEC or any other trade blocs, that India has this expertise in exporting consultancy and services, which all these trade blocs trying to exclude. And that leads to the problem. It does make sense for India to have bilateral, CEPAs, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements, in order to sidestep all these things, there was some limited kind of FTA arrangement being talked with the United States during Trump's presidency. But that did not happen, and the current administration is not at all interested. But from a long-term perspective, if United States has to engage India, it will have to be engagement at India's terms. And I think the problems in Indo-Pacific, larger problems, security issues are not helped by a rigid and inflexible attitude of the US bureaucracy. Any comments?
You said not helped by the US attitude.
Yep.
So, the US policy to the Indo-Pacific is largely strategic. So my problem is while I align with you strategically, where is the non-strategic benefit to me on economy, on technology? There you still treat me as a junior partner. You don't give me access. ASEAN complains about the same thing. The same thing with the European Union. You want to have a strategic partnership, but there is no content to it other than the military content. And European Union has no military content other than France and to an extent Germany or outside that the UK. So with America, I think it is going to be the most important partnership for India ahead. But it has to flourish in areas beyond the supply of defense equipment, for which also transfers of technology are not. We cannot only be a market for defense equipment. And that is why in the media and the think tanks in the US, I see comments that India is not a reliable partner against China. But I mean, you realize it now. I mean, you please look at all the Quad communiques. We have been so clear that we should not criticize China. We are not trying to provoke China. We don't want a war with China. But we don't want China to have its way in our region. There's a nuanced difference between that. So simply because we don't want China to be expansive does not mean that you will provoke us into pushing them and then we will be like a Ukraine fighting the Russians. That will not happen with India.
If we see the past NATO interventions outside the European theater, wherever NATO has intervened, there's really no success. There has been quagmire, or the conflicts have persisted and have not actually been resolved with enduring peace. One of the concerns about NATO presence overall in Indo-Pacific is that NATO's foolhardy actions in Indo-Pacific region in any military conflict will perpetuate the conflict, cause a lot of loss of life, loss of economic prosperity to countries in the Indo-Pacific region, and will not serve anybody's purpose except for some of the NATO countries. Any comments on that?
So, once the Americans decide to do something, they invariably do it. So, are they taking India's vote into account on whether NATO should come to Indo-Pacific? I don't know. But recently, when I wrote an article about NATO and the Indo-Pacific, and I said what I have been telling you, there were several people who approached me and said, but don't you see anything positive coming from this? I said, I do. But like the Quad, you must defang yourself, no? Don't give me only military solutions. Give me solution for maritime security. Tell me that you will share space technology. Tell me that you will share AI, defense-related tech. There are many things. The challenges of climate change, these are global, all these issues. Yes, if NATO says, I am going to come to the Indo-Pacific and share public good with my friends in the Indo-Pacific, that is fine.
Thank you, Ambassador Gurjit Singh. It was a pleasure to have you on our show. Your views are very explicit about Indo-Pacific region, NATO's involvement, and India's stance. We wanted our viewers to appreciate the nuances from a practitioner who has deep and dense experience in the region, not only in Indo-Pacific region, as you said that you served in two European countries also that happen to be NATO countries. We are in very uncharted territory, and I think we have to make scrupulous moves. So we understand your clarity of vision as to what is needed, what is required. We are very thankful for you to come on our platform. We hope that we will continue to have your wisdom and your experience on our platform on geopolitical issues of contemporary interest. With that,
Dr. Adityanjee, for having me. I enjoyed talking to you, and have a very good day.
thank you, Ambassador Gurjit Singh. Thanks a lot. Namaskar.